Search for a Method by Jean-Paul Sartre. This is the second part of Chapter 2, The Problem of Mediations and Auxiliary Disciplines. Consider Lucas. His expression, the permanent carnival of fetishized interiority, is not only pedantic and vague, its very appearance is suspect. The addition of one violent and concrete word, carnival, which suggests color, agitation, noise, is for the obvious purpose of covering up the poverty of the concept and its gratuity. For ultimately, either the intention is merely to indicate the literary subjectivism of the period, and this is to state the obvious since the subjectivism was openly proclaimed, or else it is to claim that the relation of the author to his subjectivity was necessarily a process of fetishizing, and this is said much too quickly. Wilde, Proust, Bergson, Gide, Joyce, there are as many different relations to the subjective as there are names. On the contrary, one could show that neither Joyce, nor Proust, nor Gide fetishizes interiority. Not Joyce, who wanted to create a mirror of the world, to challenge the common language, and to lay down the foundations of a new linguistic universality, nor Proust, who dissolved the self in his analyses, and whose sole purpose was to use the magic of pure memory so that the real, external object might be reborn in its absolute uniqueness, nor Gide, who kept himself within the tradition of Aristotelian humanism. Lucas's notion is not derived from experience. It has not been established by studying the conduct of particular men. Its false individuality is a Hegelian idea, like the unhappy consciousness or the beautiful soul, which creates for itself its own instruments. This lazy Marxism puts everything into everything, makes real men into the symbols of its myths. Thus, the only philosophy which can really grasp the complexity of the human being is transformed into a paranoiac dream. To situate, for Gorati, means, on the one hand, to link together the universality of a period, of a condition, of a class, and its relations of force with other classes, and, on the other hand, the universality of a defensive or offensive attitude, a social practice, or an ideological concept. But the system of correspondences between abstract universals is constructed deliberately to suppress the group or the man whom one claims to consider. If I want to understand Valéry, that petite bourgeois intellectual, sprung from that historical concrete group, the French petite bourgeoisie at the end of the last century, then it is better for me not to consult the Marxists. In place of that numerically defined group, they will substitute the idea of its material conditions, of its position with respect to other groups. The petite bourgeois is always viewed from the one side, from the other, and of its internal contradictions. We shall go back to the economic category. We shall find petite bourgeois property threatened at the same time by capitalist concentration and by popular demands. Here is naturally the basis for the fluctuations of its social attitude. All that is quite correct. This skeleton of universality is truth itself at its abstract level. Let us go further. When the questions proposed remain within the domain of the universal, these schematic elements by their combination sometimes enable us to find answers. But the problem concerns Valéry. Our abstract Marxist is not moved in the slightest. He will affirm the constant progress of materialism. Then he will describe a certain idealism, analytic, mathematical, slightly tinged with pessimism, which he will finally offer us as a simple riposte, already defensive, to the materialistic rationalism of the rising philosophy. All its characteristics will be determined dialectically in relation to this materialism. It is always the materialism which is presented as the independent variable, which never undergoes any modification. This thought of the subject of history in expression of historical praxis has the role of an active inductor. In the works and ideas of the bourgeoisie, one doesn't want to see anything but practical attempts, and always vain ones, to parry more and more violent attacks, to fill the pockets, to stop up the breaches and the fissures, to assimilate hostile infiltrations. The almost total indetermination of ideology thus described will permit the making of an abstract scheme to preside over the composition of contemporary works. At that moment, the analysis stops, and the Marxist judges his work finished. As for Valery, he has disappeared. For our part, we too hold that the idealism is an object. The proof is that we give a name to it, we teach it, we adopt it or fight against it. It has a history, and it does not cease to evolve. It was once a living philosophy. It is now a dead philosophy. It testified to a certain relation among men. Today it manifests non-human relations. Among bourgeois intellectuals, for example. But precisely for this reason, we refuse to make of it an a priori transparent to the mind. This does not mean that in our view this philosophy is a thing. No, we simply consider it to be a special type of reality, an idea object. This reality belongs to the category of collectives, which we shall attempt to examine a little later. For us, its existence is real, and we shall never apprehend anything of it except by means of experiment, observation, phenomenological description, understanding, and specialized works. This real object appears to us to be a determination of the objective culture. It was once the vigorous, critical thought of a rising class. It became for the middle classes a certain mode of conservative thought. There are others of these, and in particular, a certain scientistic materialism, which, according to the occasion, seeks to legitimize utilitarianism or racism. This collective apparatus, in our view, offers a totally different reality from, for example, a Gothic church, but it possesses just as much as the church actual presence and historical depth. Many Marxists claim to see in it only the common signification. I lost my spot somehow. Many Marxists claim to see in it only the common signification of thoughts scattered across the world. We are more realists than they are. Here is one more reason why we refuse to invert the terms, to make a fetish out of the apparatus, and to take idealist intellectuals for its manifestations. We see Valery's ideology as the concrete, unique product of an existent who is characterized in part by his relations with idealism, but who must be interpreted in his particularity, and first of all in terms of the concrete group from which he has sprung. This in no way means that his relations do not include those of his environment, of his class, etc., but only that we grasp them a posteriori, by observation, and in our attempt to totalize the sum of possible knowledge on this question. Valery is a petit bourgeois intellectual, no doubt about it, but not every petit bourgeois intellectual is Valery. The heuristic inadequacy of contemporary Marxism is contained in these two sentences. Marxism lacks any hierarchy of mediations which would permit it to grasp the process which produces the person and his product inside a class and within a given society at a given historical moment. Characterizing Valery as a petit bourgeois and his work as idealist, the Marxist will find in both alike only what he has put there. It is because of this deficiency that he ends up getting rid of the particular by defining it as the simple effect of chance. Engels writes that such a man and precisely this man arises at a determined period and in a given country is naturally pure chance. But, lacking Napoleon, another man would have filled his place. The same is true of all chance events and of all that appears to be chance in history. The farther removed the province which we are exploring is from economy, and the more it cloaks itself in an abstract ideological character, the more chance we find in its development. But trace the middle axis of the curve. This axis tends to become parallel to that of the economic development. In other words, the concrete character of this man is, for Engels, an abstract ideological character, Only the middle axis of the curve of a life, of a history, of a party, or of a social group has anything real or intelligible. And this moment of universality corresponds to another universality, economics proper. Existentialism considers Engels' statement an arbitrary limitation of the dialectical movement, an arresting of thought, a refusal to understand. Existentialism refuses to abandon the real life to the unthinkable chances of birth for the sake of contemplating a universality limited to reflecting indefinitely upon itself. It intends, without being unfaithful to Marxist principles, to find mediations which allow the individual concrete, the particular life, the real and dated conflict, the person, to emerge from the background of the general contradictions of productive forces and relations of production. Contemporary Marxism shows, for example, that Flaubert's realism offers a kind of reciprocal symbolization in relation to the social and political evolution of the petite bourgeoisie of the Second Empire. But it never shows the genesis of this reciprocity of perspective. We do not know why Flaubert preferred literature to everything else, nor why he lived like an anchorite, nor why he wrote these books rather than those of Duranty or the Goncourt brothers. Goncourt? I don't know. Marxism situates, but no longer ever discovers anything. It allows other disciplines, without principles, to establish the exact circumstances of the life and of the person, and it arrives finally at demonstrating that its schemata have been once more verified. Things being what they are, the class struggle having assumed this or that form, Flaubert, who belonged to the bourgeoisie, had to live as he lived and to write as he wrote. What is passed over in silence is the signification of these four words, belonged to the bourgeoisie. For it is neither his rental income nor the strictly intellectual nature of his work which first makes Flaubert a bourgeois. He belongs to the bourgeoisie because he was born in it. That is, because he appeared in the midst of a family already bourgeois, the head of which, a surgeon at Rouen, was carried along by the ascending movement of his class. If Flaubert reasons and feels as a bourgeois, this is because he has been made such at a period when he could not even comprehend the meaning of the gestures and the roles which were imposed upon him. Like all families, this family was particular. The mother was related to the nobility, the father was the son of a village veterinarian. Gustave's older brother, superficially more gifted, became very early the object of Gustave's hatred. It is then inside the particularity of a history, through the peculiar contradictions of this family, that Gustave Flaubert unwittingly served his class apprenticeship. Chance does not exist, or at least not in the way that is generally believed. The child becomes this or that because he lives the universal as particular. This child lived in the particular the conflict between the religious ceremonies of a monarchist regime, which was claiming a renaissance, and the irreligion of his father, a petit bourgeois intellectual and son of the French Revolution. Considered in general terms, this conflict expressed the struggle of the former landowners against the purchasers of national property and the industrial bourgeoisie. This contradiction, masked, however, under the restoration by a temporary equilibrium, Flaubert lived for himself alone and by himself. His aspirations toward nobility and especially toward faith were continually beaten down by the analytical mind of his father. Consequently, there was set up inside him this overwhelming father who did not cease, even after death, to destroy God, his principal adversary, nor to reduce the impulses of a son to bodily humors. The small Flaubert, however, lived all this through in darkness, that is, without gaining any real awareness, but in panic, flight, bewilderment, and within the limits of his material circumstances as a bourgeois child, well nourished, well cared for, but helpless and separated from the world. It was as a child that he lived his future condition, through the professions which would be offered to him. His hatred of his older brother, a brilliant student at the Faculté de Médecine, barred the path to the sciences. That is, Gustave neither wished nor dared to become part of the petite bourgeois elite. There remained the law. Through these professions, which he guarded as inferior, he had a horror of his own class, and this very horror was at once an attainment of awareness and a definitive alienation from the petite bourgeoisie. He lived also the bourgeois death, that solitude which accompanies us from the moment of birth, but he lived it by means of the family structures. The garden where he played with his sister was next to the laboratory in which his father practiced dissection. Death, corpses, his young sister who was soon to die, his father's science and irreligion, all had to be unified in a complex and very particular attitude. The explosive mixture of naive scientism and religion without God which constituted Flaubert, and which he tried to overcome by his love of formal art, can be explained if we understand that everything took place in childhood, that is, in a condition radically distinct from the adult condition. It is childhood which sets up unsurpassable prejudices. It is childhood which, in the violence of training and the frenzy of the tamed beast, makes us experience the fact of our belonging to our environment as a unique event. Today, psychoanalysis alone enables us to study the process by which a child, groping in the dark, is going to attempt to play, without understanding it, the social role which adults impose upon him. Only psychoanalysis will show us whether he stifles in his role, whether he seeks to escape it, or is entirely assimilated into it. Psychoanalysis alone allows us to discover the whole man in the adult, that is, not only his present determinations, but also the weight of his history. And one be entirely wrong in supposing that this discipline is opposed to dialectical materialism. To be sure, amateurs in the West have constructed analytical theories of society or of history which indeed end up in idealism. How many times has someone attempted the feat of psychoanalyzing Robespierre for us, without even understanding that the contradictions in his behavior were conditioned by the objective contradictions of the situation? When one has understood how the bourgeoisie of Thermidor, paralyzed by the democratic regime, found itself forced by practical necessity to demand a military dictatorship, then it is most annoying to read from the pen of a psychiatrist that Napoleon is, explained by his will to fail. De Man, the Belgian socialist, went still further when he tried to explain class conflicts by the proletariat's inferiority complex. Inversely, Marxism, once it became a universal knowledge, wanted to integrate psychoanalysis into itself by first twisting its neck. Marxism made of it a dead idea which quite naturally found its place in a desiccated system. It was idealism returning in disguise, an avatar of the fetishism of interiority. In the one case, as in the other, a method has been transformed into dogmatism. The philosophers of psychoanalysis find their justification in the Marxist schematizers and vice versa. The fact is that dialectical materialism cannot deprive itself much longer of the one privileged mediation which permits it to pass from general and abstract determinations to particular traits of the single individual. Psychoanalysis has no principles. It has no theoretical foundation. And this is quite all right if it accompanies, as in the work of Jung and in certain works of Freud, a completely innocuous mythology. In fact, it is a method which is primarily concerned with establishing the way in which the child lives his family relations inside a given society. And this does not mean that it raises any doubts as to the priority of institutions. Quite the contrary, its object itself depends on the structure of a particular family, and this is only a certain individual manifestation of the family structure appropriate to such and such a class under such and such conditions. Thus, psychoanalytic monographs, if it were always possible to have them, would by themselves throw light upon the evolution of the French family between the 18th and 20th century. which in its turn would express in its own way the general evolution of the relations of production. Today's Marxists are concerned only with adults. Reading them, one would believe that we are born at the age when we earn our first wages. They have forgotten their own childhoods. As we read them, everything seems to happen as if men experience their alienation and their reification first in their own work, whereas in actuality each one lives it first, as a child in his parents' work. Dead set against interpretations too exclusively sexual, Marxists make use of them in order to condemn a method of interpretation which claims only to put history in place of nature in each person. They have not yet understood that sexuality is only one way of living the totality of our condition, at a certain level and within the perspective of a certain individual venture. Existentialism, on the contrary, believes that it can integrate the psychoanalytic method which discovers the point of insertion for man and his class, that is, the particular family, as a mediation between the universal class and the individual. The family, in fact, is constituted by and in the general movement of history, but is experienced, on the other hand, as an absolute in the depth and opaqueness of childhood. The Flaubert family was of the semi-domestic type. It was a little behind the industrial families which the father Flaubert cared for or visited. The father Flaubert, who felt that he was wronged by his patron Dupuytren, terrorized everyone with his own worth and ability, his Voltairean irony, his terrible angers and fits of melancholy. We will also easily understood that the bond between the small Gustave and his mother was never determining. She was only a reflection of the terrible doctor. Thus we have before us an almost tangible cleavage which will often separate Flaubert from his contemporaries in a century when the conjugal family is the type current among the wealthy bourgeoisie, when Duchamp and Le Poitvin represent children freed from the patria potestas. Flaubert is characterized by a fixation on his father. Baudelaire, on the other hand, born the same year, will be fixed all his life on his mother. And this difference is explained by the difference in their respective environments. Flaubert's bourgeoisie is harsh, new. His mother, vaguely connected with the nobility, represents a class of landowners in process of liquidation. The father comes straight out of a village and wears strange peasant clothing even at Rouen, a goatskin in winter. The bourgeoisie comes from the country, and it returns there too, since it uses its gradually won wealth to buy land. Baudelaire's family, bourgeois, urban for many years already, considers itself in some small way belonging to the new nobility, la noblesse de robe. It owns stocks and bonds. Sometimes, between two masters, the mother appeared all alone in the glory of her independence. Later, it was all in vain for Opic to play at being the boss. Madame Opic, stupid and rather vain, but charming and favored by her period, never ceased to exist in her own right. But we must be careful. Each one lives his first years distracted or bewildered as a profound and solitary reality. Here, the internalization of the external is an irreducible fact. The flaw of the small Baudelaire is, to be sure, the widowhood and remarriage of a very pretty mother. But it is also a peculiar quality of his own life, a disequilibrium, an unhappiness which will pursue him until his death. Flaubert's fixation on his father is the expression of a group structure, and it is his hatred of the bourgeois, his hysterical crises, his monastic vocation. Psychoanalysis, working within a dialectical totalization, refers on the one side to objective structures, to material conditions, and on the other to the action upon our adult life of the childhood we never wholly surpass. Henceforth, it becomes impossible to connect Madame Bovary directly to the political social structure and to the evolution of the petite bourgeoisie. The book will have to be referred back to contemporary reality insofar as it was lived by Flaubert throughout his childhood. There results from this a certain discrepancy, to be sure. There's a sort of hysteresis. on the part of the work in relation to the very period in which it appears. This is because it must unite within itself a number of contemporary significations and certain others which express a state recent but already surpassed by society. This hysteresis, always neglected by the Marxists, accounts in turn for the veritable social reality in which contemporary events, products, and acts are characterized by the extraordinary diversity of their temporal depth. There will come a moment at which Flaubert will appear to be in advance of his period, at the time of Madame Bovary, because he is behind it, because his book, in disguised form, expresses to a generation disgusted with romanticism the post-romantic despairs of a student of 1830. The objective meaning of the book, which the Marxists, as good disciples of Taine, take simply as conditioned by the moment represented in the author, is the result of a compromise between what this new generation of readers claims in terms of its own history and what the author can offer to it from his own. That is, it realizes the paradoxical union of two past moments of this intellectual petite bourgeoisie, 1830 and 1845. It is in these terms that one will be able to use the book in a new perspective, as a weapon against a class or a government. But Marxism has nothing to fear from these new methods. They simply reinstate concrete regions of the real, and the individual person's distress takes on its true meaning when one recalls that it expresses concretely the alienation of man. Existentialism, aided by psychoanalysis, can study today only situations in which man has been lost since childhood, for there are no others in a society founded on exploitation. We have not finished with mediations at the level of the relations of production and at that of political, social structures. The unique person is found conditioned by his human relations. No doubt this conditioning, in its first general truth, refers to the conflict of productive forces with the relations of production. But all this is not lived so simply, or rather the question is to know whether reduction is possible. The person lives and knows his condition more or less clearly through the groups he belongs to. The majority of these groups are local, definite, immediately given. It is clear, in fact, that the factory worker is subject to the pressure of his production group, but if, as is the case at Paris, he lives rather far from his place of work, he is equally subject to the pressure of his residential group. Now these groups exert various actions upon their members. Sometimes even the particular block, the housing project, the neighborhood, checks in each person the impetus given by the factory or the shop. The problem is to know whether Marxism will dissolve the residential group into its elements, or whether it will recognize in it a relative autonomy and a power of mediation. The decision is not easy, or is not so easy. On one side, in fact, one easily sees that the lag between the residential group and the production group, along with the retardation which the former exerts on the latter, only helps to verify the fundamental analyses of Marxism. In one sense, there is nothing new here, and the Communist Party itself has shown since its birth that it is aware of this contradiction. Wherever possible, it organizes cells based on working locations rather than residential districts. On the other side, it is everywhere apparent that the employer, when he attempts to modernize his methods, favors the constitution of extra-political groups as a check, the effect of which in France is certainly to remove the young from union and political activity. At Annecy, for example, which is being industrialized very rapidly and which pushes tourists and vacationers over to those sections which border on the lake, researchers report that there is a proliferation of small groups, culture, societies, sport groups, amateur radio clubs, etc., whose character is very ambiguous. There's no doubt that they raise the cultural level of their members, which in any event will remain an acquisition of the proletariat, but it is certain that they are obstacles to emancipation. Furthermore, it would be necessary to consider whether in these societies, which in many cases the employers have shrewdly left completely autonomous, Culture is not necessarily oriented, that is, in the direction of bourgeois ideology. Statistics show that the books most often requested by workers are the bourgeois bestsellers. These considerations tend to make of the relation to the group a reality that is lived for itself and which possesses a particular efficacy. In the case which concerns us, for example, there is no doubt that it is interposed as a screen between the individual and the general interests of his class. This group consistency, which must not be confused with any sort of collective consciousness, would by itself justify what the Americans call micro-sociology. Even more, sociology in the United States is developed because of its very efficiency. To those who may be tempted to see in sociology only a mode of idealist, static knowing, the sole function of which is to conceal history, I would recall the fact that in the United States it is the employer who favors this discipline and who in particular sponsors the research which studies restricted groups as the totalization of human contacts in a defined situation. Moreover, American neo-paternalism and human engineering are based almost exclusively on the work of sociologists. But one must not make those factors an excuse for adopting immediately the reverse attitude and summarily rejecting sociology on the ground that it is a class weapon in the hands of the capitalists. If it is an effective weapon and it has proved that it is one, this is because it contains some truth. And if it is in the hands of the capitalists, this is one more reason for snatching it away from the capitalists and turning it back against them. No doubt the principle of sociological research is often a disguised idealism. In the work of Lewin, for example, as with all Gestaltists, there is a fetishism of totalization. Instead of seeing in it the real movement of history, Lewin hypostasizes it and realizes it in already made totalities. He writes, "It is necessary to consider this situation with all its social and cultural implications as a dynamic, concrete whole." Or again, the structural properties of a dynamic totality are not the same as those of its parts. On the one hand, we are presented with a synthesis of externality, and to this given totality, the sociologist himself remains external. He wants to hold on to the benefits of teleology, while at the same time maintaining the attitude of positivism, that is, while suppressing or disguising the ends of human activity. At this point, sociology is posited for itself and is opposed to Marxism, not by affirming the provisional autonomy of its method, which would, on the contrary, provide the means for integrating it, but by affirming the radical autonomy of its object. First, it is an ontological autonomy. No matter what precaution one takes, one cannot prevent the group, thus conceived, from being a substantial unity, even and especially if, out of a desire for empiricism, one defines its existence by its simple function. Second, it is a methodological autonomy. In place of the movement of dialectical totalization, one substitutes actual totalities. This step naturally implies a refusal of dialectic and of history, exactly because dialectic is at the start only the real movement of unity in process of being made, and not the study, not even the functional and dynamic study of a unity already made. For Lewin, every law is a structural law and expresses a function or a functional relation between the parts of a whole. Precisely for this reason, he deliberately confines himself to the study of what Lefebvre called horizontal complexity. He studies neither the history of the individual, psychoanalysis, nor that of the group. Lewin is the most open to Lefebvre's criticism, which we quoted earlier. His method claims to establish the functional characteristics of a rural community in the United States, but it will interpret all of them in relation to the variations of the totality. For this very reason, therefore, his method will be lacking in any history, since it prohibits itself, for example, from explaining the remarkable religious homogeneity of a group of Protestant farmers. It is of little importance to Lewin to know that the total susceptibility of rural communities to urban models arises in the United States from the fact that the country was formed from the existing city in mind, by men who were already in possession of relatively advanced industrial techniques. Lewin would consider this explanation, to use his terminology, an Aristotelian causalism. But this means precisely that he is incapable of understanding the synthesis in the form of a dialectic. For him, it would have to be given. Finally, it is a reciprocal autonomy of the experimenter and of the experimental group. The sociologist is not situated, or if he is, concrete precautions will suffice to desituate him. It may be that he tries to integrate himself into the group, but this integration is temporary. He knows that he will disengage himself, that he will record his observations objectively. In short, he resembles those detectives whom the movies often present to us as models, who win the confidence of a gang so as to be better able to trap it. Even if the sociologist and the detective participate in a collective action, it is evident that they put their act between parentheses, that they make these gestures for the benefit of a higher interest.